On the frost-covered hills of the kingdom of Avaloria, a grand stone palace rose like a fortress into the pale morning sky. Its towers cast long shadows over the misty valley below, and every corridor seemed to whisper secrets of ambition and betrayal. Inside, 3-year-old Isolde pressed her small hands against a tall window pane, staring down at the courtyard where guards and courtiers moved like figures in a delicate and dangerous dance. That morning, she witnessed the most terrifying event of her young life. Her mother, Princess Seraphine, accused of treason, stripped of her titles and led to the execution platform. The cries of the crowd, the metallic clatter of guards' boots, and her mother's trembling voice echoed in her mind, embedding a fear that would never fully leave her. Though she barely understood the intricate politics of the court, Isolde learned early that survival demanded more than obedience. It required intelligence, patience, and the ability to interpret every glance, gesture, and whisper. Her father, King Alaric, was a man whose favor could grant life, and whose anger could destroy it. Every relationship in the palace was a fragile balance, where loyalty could shift in a heartbeat, and betrayal could come from those closest to you. In this environment, children were taught that power was everything, love was fleeting, and one misstep could be fatal. Isolde's education began as a matter of survival. She learned languages, Latin, French, Greek, studied the histories of other kingdoms, and absorbed lessons in diplomacy and strategy. But beyond academics, she learned to read people, to discern ambition and deceit in subtle expressions, to anticipate danger before it materialized. By the age of 7, she had developed a keen eye for court intrigue, noting the flickers of envy in a noble's gaze, or the suppressed panic in a servant's movement. These skills would later define her as a queen capable of commanding respect and fear in equal measure. Despite the constant vigilance demanded by the palace, Isolde retained a spark of wonder. She would wander the frost-laden gardens at dawn, marveling at the way sunlight fractured across the ice and created fleeting rainbows. These brief moments offered a fragile sanctuary, a reminder that the world held beauty beyond the reach of politics and fear. She realized that inner strength was a seed to be nurtured in secret, quietly and patiently. The death of Princess Seraphine marked more than a personal tragedy. It was a crucible that forged Isolde's understanding of power, identity, and survival. She learned that appearances could protect or endanger her, that influence could be wielded as a weapon, and that even the most intimate bonds were fragile under the weight of ambition. From these early blood-soaked years, Isolde began the transformation, from a frightened child into a young woman whose mind, insight, and later her carefully crafted image would become her greatest assets. By the time Isolde reached her 20th year, the kingdom of Avaloria faced a relentless epidemic. The smallpox plague had swept through the city, leaving disfigurement, death, and fear in its wake. Isolde herself was not spared. Red pustules and deep scars began to mar her otherwise delicate features, threatening the image of perfection the court demanded. In a society where a monarch's appearance was believed to reflect divine favor, these blemishes were not merely cosmetic, they were political hazards. Determined not to show weakness, Isolde sought remedies from the kingdom's court physicians and traveling alchemists. Among their suggestions was the infamous Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, praised for creating smooth, pale skin. At first, the results were miraculous. Her complexion regained a luminous alabaster quality, causing foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries to marvel at her renewed beauty. Once again, her allure became a diplomatic weapon, giving her leverage in political negotiations and reigniting suitors' interest across Europe. Yet every application of the ceruse carried a hidden cost. Lead, the primary ingredient, slowly poisoned her body with each daily ritual. She spent hours in front of the mirror each morning, layering the substance to cover imperfections, inadvertently setting herself on a path toward chronic poisoning. As her obsession with maintaining perfection grew, so did her isolation. Courtiers began to whisper, noting her pale, almost mask-like face and her increasingly meticulous routines. Isolde's reliance on cosmetics soon expanded beyond lead-based creams. She experimented with rouge containing mercury, powders of exotic minerals, and even bizarre treatments recommended by the most learned physicians, raw egg masks, herbal pastes, and rare oils. Each promised rejuvenation, each delivered toxicity. She tolerated the pain and the odd taste, convinced that her appearance preserved her authority, that every flaw revealed might weaken her power. The political ramifications were immediate. Courts abroad resumed marriage negotiations, envoys praised her beauty, and alliances that had wavered were renewed. Isolde understood that the preservation of her image was inseparable from the maintenance of her kingdom's stability. Her youth and health, however, were being sacrificed at a silent, invisible altar. Physically, the cumulative effects were subtle at first: headaches, fatigue, mild irritability. But over years, the lead and mercury took their toll. Cognitive sharpness dulled, memory faltered, and concentration wavered. Even the simplest conversations demanded effort, and small mistakes in court affairs began to frustrate her. In private, Isolde would sometimes stare at her reflection and shiver, recognizing the toll her obsession had exacted, yet she felt unable to stop. To remove the mask would be to expose vulnerability, an act she believed her enemies could exploit. Emotionally, the young queen became guarded and distant. She trusted no one entirely, yet relied heavily on a select few ladies-in-waiting and advisors to manage her routines and the ever-growing inventory of exotic cosmetics. These attendants witnessed the long, meticulous mornings of ritual preparation, the quiet obsession with perfection, and the subtle but noticeable shifts in her temperament. Sometimes she would erupt into sudden rages over trivial matters, a misplaced brush, a smudge on her skin, and then retreat for hours, brooding over perceived betrayals. Still, her brilliance as a ruler remained undiminished in public. Diplomats and citizens alike continued to see her as an emblem of strength, poise, and beauty. Behind the gilded curtains, however, Isolde's body was slowly betraying her, and the mirrors she relied upon had begun to reflect not just her beauty, but the shadow of a fragile, overworked, and poisoned monarch. The daily act of preserving her visage had become both armor and shackle, binding her to a dangerous equilibrium between authority and vanity. In the quiet of her chambers at night, she would sometimes trace the fading scars beneath the layers of cosmetics and wonder if her power was worth the price. She knew instinctively that she had transformed a tool of survival into a slow-acting weapon against herself, and yet the world outside demanded the perfection that she could no longer fully attain without poison. By the end of the decade, the foundations of Isolde's reign were secure, but at the cost of her own body. The very beauty that had restored. Her influence in foreign courts had planted the seeds of a tragic vulnerability. She had learned the cruelest lesson of all: the preservation of power, like the preservation of youth, exacts a price few can see, and fewer are prepared to pay. By her 25th year, Isolde had become a figure both revered and feared throughout Avaloria. Her beauty, meticulously preserved by decades of lead-based cosmetics and exotic treatments, had become a symbol of power. Courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike interpreted her flawless complexion as evidence of divine favor, unaware of the invisible toll it exacted. Yet, behind the alabaster mask, her body and mind were silently deteriorating, slowly poisoned by the very substances that protected her image. The palace had transformed into a stage where appearances dictated reality. Every gesture, every glance, and every word carried weight, and Isolde had learned to perform her role with precision. She would spend hours examining herself in polished mirrors, adjusting her posture, her expression, even the tilt of her head to convey confidence and unassailable authority. Visitors saw only a composed, elegant monarch. Only she knew the anxiety and pain concealed beneath the surface. Despite her outward control, the physical effects of chronic poisoning began to manifest. Persistent headaches and fatigue shadowed her daily life, and occasional lapses in memory made her rely heavily on advisors and attendants. Even so, Isolde refused to relinquish the rituals that sustained her public image. Each morning was a meticulous process: the application of Venetian ceruse to her skin, rouge and pigments to define her features, and various concoctions to enhance the effect of her mask. These procedures, lasting several hours, became both a shield and a prison. Her obsession with perfection also influenced her political decisions. Isolde's advisors noted that she often evaluated potential allies and rivals not only on their skills and loyalty, but on the optics of their presentation. How their demeanor and appearance could reflect on her own image. Diplomacy became an intricate dance of appearances, where even minor slights or unflattering depictions could be interpreted as threats. Her acute attention to visual detail was both a strength and a vulnerability, exposing her to manipulation by those who understood the fragility behind the mask. Yet, Isolde's intellect remained formidable. She orchestrated negotiations, settled disputes, and directed state affairs with remarkable acuity. However, the psychological strain of maintaining her flawless facade caused increasing isolation. She rarely trusted courtiers fully, often retreating to private chambers where mirrors surrounded her like silent witnesses. These reflective surfaces, curved and tinted to flatter her features, became companions in her solitude, but also constant reminders of the fragile barrier between perception and reality. As the years passed, whispers began to circulate within the court. Some courtiers speculated on the queen's erratic moods and sudden rages. Others noted the mask-like quality of her appearance, her movements slightly stiff, her expressions sometimes unnatural. Despite these observations, no one dared confront her openly. Fear and reverence ensured that the performance continued uninterrupted, even as the hidden cost of power became increasingly apparent. The psychological effects were profound. Isolde found herself increasingly anxious about public perception, obsessing over how each event, portrait, or negotiation might reflect on her eternal image. Every moment in the spotlight was a delicate balancing act between authority and vulnerability. Even as she navigated crises and celebrated victories, a quiet terror lingered. The fear that her carefully constructed image might crumble, revealing the poisoned and fragile woman beneath. By the end of this chapter in her life, Isolde had achieved a terrifying mastery over appearances. She projected the image of an unassailable monarch, commanding respect and loyalty from her subjects, while secretly contending with the physical and psychological consequences of decades of self-inflicted harm. The mask she wore was both her greatest weapon and her gravest curse, a symbol of authority that demanded constant maintenance and a silent reminder of her mortality. In the mirror, she would sometimes catch glimpses of the person she had once been. A child who had witnessed her mother's execution, a young woman scarred by illness, and now a queen haunted by the very image that defined her reign. Behind the mask of authority lay a fragile human being, desperately balancing the demands of power against the relentless decay wrought by vanity and necessity. As Isolde entered her 30th year, the toll of decades of meticulous beauty rituals became increasingly impossible to ignore. Her body, silently accumulating the toxins of lead, mercury, and exotic minerals, began to betray her. The very cosmetic practices that had preserved her political power now threatened to destroy the woman behind the mask. Each morning's ritual became more elaborate and arduous, lasting longer, involving increasingly exotic and dangerous substances that promised miraculous rejuvenation. Her chambers resembled a laboratory of medieval alchemy. Glass jars and ceramic bowls lined the walls filled with powders, tinctures, and ointments sourced from distant lands. Alchemists and physicians visited frequently, offering new treatments, mercury-laced pastes, rare oils, and powdered gems. Isolde's curiosity and obsession with perfection knew no bounds. She would experiment on herself, measuring minute quantities, blending substances with precision, believing that each application brought her closer to an ideal of eternal youth. Yet, with each passing year, the physical consequences became undeniable. Her once graceful walk became slightly uneven, and moments of dizziness appeared unbidden. Chronic fatigue and headaches haunted her daily life. Her hands trembled as she applied the thick layers of ceruse, sometimes cracking and flaking under the weight of the toxic concoctions. Even so, she refused to compromise. The illusion of perfection was inseparable from her authority. To appear anything less than flawless would risk her political standing, and perhaps even invite rebellion. The psychological effects were equally severe. Isolation deepened as Isolde retreated from the public eye, emerging only for essential ceremonies. Her trust in courtiers dwindled further, leaving only a select few attendants privy to her private rituals. These loyal aides witnessed the queen's growing paranoia. She scrutinized every reflection, every shadow, every whisper in the hallways of the palace. Even portraits commissioned during this period had to adhere to strict standards, depicting her with smooth, ageless skin, regardless of the truth beneath. The court adapted to her obsessions. Specially designed mirrors were installed in every chamber, subtly curved or tinted to present the queen in the most flattering light. Courtiers learned to navigate the delicate social rules. A misplaced glance or an unflattering gesture could trigger her sudden fury. Diplomacy became a complex choreography of appearances, with Isolde's physical perfection serving as the centerpiece, a silent declaration of her continued power and divine favor. Despite the growing toxicity of her cosmetics, her brilliance as a ruler persisted. She skillfully navigated alliances, quelled disputes, and maintained the kingdom's stability. But the veneer of control was fragile. Courtiers began to notice signs of deterioration, occasional lapses in memory, subtle tremors, and an increasing irritability that could erupt into unpredictable rages. The contrast between the immaculate queen and the vulnerable body beneath created a tension that filled every corner of the palace. Isolde's obsession with her appearance also shaped her identity. She began to define herself entirely through the lens of her mask. Beauty was authority, and authority was survival. The daily rituals became rituals of power as much as vanity, and the line between political necessity and personal obsession blurred. She reflected frequently on the cost of her perfection, aware that her body suffered for every political advantage, yet unable to abandon the mask that had preserved her reign. In private moments, she would sometimes catch glimpses of the scars and disfigurements that lay beneath her layers of makeup. These glimpses were fleeting, quickly erased by the mask she meticulously maintained. The mirrors, once tools of observation, had become instruments of obsession, reflecting not reality, but the impossible ideal she believed she must uphold. And so, the alchemy of vanity continued, a delicate, dangerous experiment in which beauty, power, and self-destruction were inextricably intertwined. By the end of this chapter in her life, Isolde had become a tragic paradox, outwardly perfect and commanding, yet internally compromised and slowly decaying. Her kingdom flourished under her intellect and strategic acumen, yet she remained a prisoner of her own vanity, bound by the very image that had made her powerful. The alchemy of beauty had become a silent, deadly force, threatening to consume the queen who had sacrificed herself to maintain the illusion of eternal youth. By the time Isolde reached her 35th year, the ghosts of her past seemed to haunt every corner of Avaloria's grand palace. Memories of her mother's brutal execution and her own precarious survival lingered relentlessly, entwining with the psychological toll of decades of self-poisoning. Though courtiers continued to see the immaculate, commanding queen in private, Isolde wrestled with the shadows of fear, regret, and the relentless passage of time. The palace itself became a reflection of her inner turmoil. Long, dimly lit corridors echoed with the whispers of attendants and the creaks of polished floors. Mirrors, installed throughout chambers and hallways, reflected not only her flawless exterior, but also the isolation that had taken root in her life. Every glance at her own reflection reminded her of the cost of power, the sacrifices, the constant vigilance, and the hidden decay of her body. The layers of lead-based cosmetics she applied each morning were a ritual, a barrier between the world and the fragile human woman beneath. Isolde's political acumen remained unmatched. She navigated complex alliances with precision, using charm and intelligence as her instruments. However, the combination of chronic poisoning and psychological strain began to influence her decisions. Occasionally, she would react impulsively to perceived slights, her temper flaring unpredictably. Courtiers learned to anticipate these outbursts, walking carefully around the queen, each gesture calculated to maintain favor and avoid disaster. The physical consequences of her rituals grew more apparent. Her gait became unsteady, her hands trembled, and faint scars from years of chemical application marred her delicate skin beneath the cosmetic mask. Even as she projected authority, she was acutely aware of the fragility hidden beneath her perfection. In private moments, she would often examine these scars, tracing the lines with pale fingers, a silent acknowledgement of the slow destruction she had wrought upon herself. The Queen's obsession with maintaining appearances began to affect the broader court. Portraits commissioned during this period emphasized her unaging visage, creating a discrepancy between reality and perception. Artists were instructed meticulously. Every wrinkle was to be erased, every flaw concealed beneath layers of oil paint. In doing so, Isolde controlled not only her present image but also the historical record. Her reign would be remembered as flawless, ageless, and powerful, even as the Queen herself slowly deteriorated behind the scenes. Psychologically, isolation deepened. Isolde spent long hours in private chambers, conversing with attendants in hushed tones, reflecting on her past and the precariousness of life. The ghosts of family members, lost to the brutal politics of Avaloria, seemed to whisper through the halls. She would occasionally speak to empty chairs, imagining dialogues with her deceased mother or siblings, seeking counsel from figures long gone. These imagined conversations became a source of solace and torment, blending reality with memory and hallucination. Despite the creeping deterioration of body and mind, Isolde's strategic brilliance persisted. She manipulated diplomacy with subtle gestures, guided military campaigns with insight, and maintained the kingdom's stability through turbulent political currents. Yet every victory was tempered by the knowledge that her body was failing, a secret that only she fully understood. Her reliance on toxic cosmetics was both armor and prison, an outward display of power hiding a body ravaged by decades of self-inflicted harm. By the close of this chapter, Isolde had become a paradox of human strength and fragility. She was a ruler whose intellect and beauty commanded reverence, yet whose private life was governed by obsession, fear, and the irreversible effects of cosmetic poisoning. Shadows of the past intertwined with present responsibilities, creating a queen both formidable and tragically vulnerable, a ruler who had sacrificed everything to maintain an image that had long ceased to reflect the reality beneath. By the 40th year of her reign, the palace had become a labyrinth of reflections. Hallways, chambers, and even private galleries were lined with mirrors of various sizes, curved and tinted to present flattering illusions. The reflective surfaces were no longer merely decorative, they were instruments of power and psychological manipulation. Courtiers and visitors moved cautiously through these corridors, aware that each glance could provoke observation, judgment, or subtle reprimand. The Queen's obsession with perfection had transformed the court into a theater of appearances. Every event, every audience, was meticulously staged. Light sources, torches, chandeliers, and candle sconces were arranged to highlight the sheen of polished floors, the gleam of gemstones, and the subtle glow of mirrors. These reflective surfaces created layers of visual intrigue. A single room could appear infinitely larger, more opulent, and more imposing than reality, crafting an atmosphere of awe and subtle intimidation. Cosmetics, instruments of both beauty and destruction, were stored in meticulously organized chambers. Jars of powders, vials of exotic pigments, and containers of mysterious ointments filled shelves along the walls. Their labels were inscribed in elaborate script, indicating exotic origins, Venetian cerris, powdered cinnabar, crushed pearls, and oils distilled from rare flowers. The air carried a faint scent of lead, mercury, and fragrant oils, mingling into an intoxicating aroma that defined the Queen's private world. The palace also functioned as a center for courtly intrigue. Courtiers navigated not only political rivalries but also the psychological maze created by the omnipresent mirrors. Meetings and negotiations were staged carefully, with lighting and angles designed to convey authority and command respect. Subtle gestures, the direction of a glance, and positioning in reflective spaces became tools of influence. Every move was measured against the distortions of mirrors, revealing or concealing intent. Beyond mirrors and cosmetics, the architectural design itself reinforced the Queen's obsession. Hidden alcoves, secret passages, and layered chambers allowed for observation without detection. Courtiers could never be certain if they were alone or watched, creating a constant tension that kept everyone in check. The palace, in essence, had become both stage and prison, reflecting not only the grandeur of the kingdom, but also the psychological pressure exerted on all who dwelled within. The visual artistry extended to ceremonial objects. Gem-encrusted furniture, intricately embroidered tapestries, and gilded candelabras adorned each room, their placement carefully considered to enhance the illusion of space and depth in mirror reflections. Even tableware and writing implements were chosen for aesthetic harmony, ensuring that every reflection, real or illusory, contributed to the desired impression of perfection and control. Ultimately, the court of mirrors symbolized the intersection of beauty, power, and deception. It was a space where perception reigned supreme, where appearances were crafted with surgical precision, and where reality itself could be reshaped through reflection. Visitors left awed and disoriented, caught between admiration for the grandeur and unease at the subtle distortions that suggested a deeper, almost unnerving control over their environment. The palace had become an intricate living artwork, a testament to ambition, obsession, and the sometimes perilous pursuit of perfection. As the years advanced, the palace became a stage for a new kind of spectacle, the quiet but relentless toll of vanity. The queen's obsession with maintaining her flawless appearance had transformed routine life into a series of rituals that consumed both time and resources. Chambers once reserved for scholarly pursuits and strategic planning now brimmed with cosmetic tools, mirrors, and exotic pigments, arranged with meticulous precision. Each item represented both power and peril. Jars of Venetian cerris, powdered cinnabar, mercury-based ointments, and crushed pearls, substances as beautiful as they were lethal, lined the shelves in carefully measured quantities. The physical consequences of decades of toxic cosmetics were gradually becoming undeniable, even to the most cautious courtiers. Floors were often scuffed from hurried movement as attendants transported delicate powders and liquids. Mirrors, originally installed to magnify grandeur, now reflected a harsh truth. The accumulation of layers over layers of chemicals had changed the very nature of the queen's presence. Rooms filled with faint metallic odors, mingled with fragrant oils intended to mask the harsher scents of lead and mercury. Every object in the palace bore witness to the cost of perfection. From tarnished candelabras to cracked porcelain jars, their surfaces catching the light in unsettling patterns. Rituals of beauty extended beyond personal chambers into the grand halls. Elaborate dressing tables, once reserved for formal preparation, now dominated entire corridors. Surfaces gleamed under chandeliers, reflecting every ornate detail. Gilded frames, embroidered cushions, and rows of cosmetic implements. Courtiers moving carefully through these spaces had to navigate not only physical obstacles but also the psychological weight of observation. Each gesture, each step, became part of an unspoken performance, reinforcing the omnipresent gaze of perfection. The palace gardens, once a source of serenity and respite, now doubled as a controlled environment for optics and reflection. Pools of water, polished fountains, and glass panels created visual illusions, extending the influence of mirrors beyond indoor chambers. Paths were designed so that sunlight would catch reflective surfaces at precise angles, creating dazzling, yet disorienting light patterns. Visitors experienced awe, but also unease, as nature itself became part of the grand illusion, manipulated to uphold a meticulously crafted image. Art and ceremony intertwined with this culture of appearance. Portraits, tapestries, and decorative objects were arranged with exacting care, each intended to reinforce the narrative of timeless beauty and unassailable power. Even mundane objects, inkstands, writing quills, and goblets, were chosen for aesthetic harmony, their placement creating visual balance and reinforcing the illusion of perfection. Mirrors multiplied these images, creating layers of reality and reflection that were both mesmerizing and subtly oppressive. Ultimately, the weight of vanity extended beyond cosmetics and reflections. It reshaped the rhythms of the court. The Bia Palace operated as a theater where every action was observed, every movement calculated, and every reflection scrutinized. Courtiers learned to anticipate the interplay of mirrors and light, to navigate ceremonial spaces with precision, and to understand that the maintenance of appearances was both a privilege and a silent threat. The pursuit of beauty had become an invisible architecture of control, dictating behavior, shaping perception, and reinforcing hierarchies through the careful orchestration of space, light, and reflection. By the end of this chapter, the palace itself had become a monument to obsession, a living map of perfection and peril. Every corridor, chamber, and garden reflected the delicate balance between display and destruction, a testament to the power of appearances and the invisible costs of maintaining them. In this realm of mirrors, light, and lethal cosmetics, the key weight of vanity was felt not just by one individual, but by all who lived under its pervasive influence. The last months of the Queen's life were marked by an unsettling stillness in the palace, a silence that seemed to echo through the mirrored halls and gilded chambers. The relentless pursuit of perfection had reached its zenith. Every reflection, every cosmetic layer, every decorative object had become part of a ritual that consumed hours each day. Courtiers moved with cautious reverence, aware that the slightest misstep could draw attention or provoke displeasure. The palace, once a seat of power and diplomacy, had transformed into a theater of obsession, a place where time itself seemed suspended beneath the weight of appearances. Mirrors, now ubiquitous, reflected more than the ornate interiors. They amplified the psychological tension of the court. Even the smallest chambers were lined with reflective surfaces, strategically placed to create depth and illusion. Chandeliers, candelabras, and polished floors multiplied light and shadow, producing a labyrinth of visual intrigue. Each room became a stage, each movement a performance. The courtiers, already conditioned to navigate this environment, were now acutely aware that reality was as much a matter of perception as it was of fact. Cosmetic tools, jars of lead-based cerus, mercury ointments, crushed gemstones, and exotic pigments littered dressing tables and shelves, creating a dense, almost suffocating atmosphere. The faint metallic scent of these substances permeated the palace, mingling with the delicate aroma of oils and florals intended to mask the toxic undertones. Every object was both a promise and a threat, a tool of beauty that concealed the gradual decay it wrought. Attendants carefully measured, applied, and removed layers of cosmetics, their movements precise, almost ritualistic, as if participating in a sacred yet deadly ceremony. The psychological effects of decades of cosmetic poisoning were undeniable. Courtiers noted an increasing unpredictability in the palace. Doors were barred at irregular intervals, rooms remained dimly lit to hide imperfections, and even ceremonial events were staged to minimize the Queen's exposure. Sounds were carefully controlled, footsteps measured, and conversations strategically muted. The architecture itself, hidden corridors, secret passages, and tiered chambers, reinforced this tense choreography. Mirrors multiplied perception, but also isolation. The palace had become a machine of surveillance, manipulation, and concealment. Daily, life was dominated by rituals of maintenance and concealment. Thick layers of cosmetics were applied and reapplied to maintain the illusion of youth. Broken mirrors were replaced, tarnished objects polished, and faint odors masked. Light and shadow were manipulated with precision, creating the illusion of spaciousness and vibrancy, even as decay silently advanced. Every surface reflected not only grandeur, but also the hidden toll of obsession and toxicity. The final descent was not just physical, but symbolic. Rooms once filled with laughter, music, and diplomacy had become quiet arenas where shadows loomed larger than life. Courtiers navigated a precarious balance, performing their duties under the unyielding gaze of mirrors that both dazzled and disoriented. Gardens, fountains, and reflecting pools mirrored the palace's interior, extending the theater of illusion into the open air. The very landscape became a participant in the ritual, reinforcing the fragile perfection that masked slow deterioration. In the closing days, the palace seemed suspended between time and illusion. Every object, reflection, and ritual bore witness to decades of meticulous control and inevitable decay. The cumulative weight of obsession, vanity, and toxic cosmetics had transformed the palace into a monument not just to grandeur, but to the perilous pursuit of an impossible ideal. By the time the last moments arrived, the environment itself, mirrors, chambers, gardens, and objects, stood as a silent testament to the extraordinary cost of perfection.